The Tiger appeared through the smoke like a vision from hell. 56 tons of German engineering, its 88-millimeter gun already traversing toward the thin armor of the American Sherman. Inside the smaller tank, 5 men sat frozen, knowing that in seconds they would be dead. Except one man, a farm boy from Iowa named Harold Brooks, was already reaching for the gear shift, his mind racing through a calculation that no training manual had ever taught him. July 14th, 1944. 5 weeks after the Allied invasion of Normandy, and the hedgerows of France had become a killing ground, unlike anything the American Army had anticipated. These were not the sweeping tank battles of North Africa or the open steppes of Russia. This was a war of 50 yards, of blind corners, of narrow lanes choked with centuries-old vegetation so thick it could hide an entire panzer division. The Bocage country, as the French called it, was a patchwork of small fields bordered by earthen banks 4 to 6 feet high, crowned with dense hedgerows of hawthorn, oak, and bramble. Each field was a natural fortress. Each lane was a potential ambush site. And in this landscape, the American M4 Sherman tank, reliable, mass-produced, and utterly outclassed by German armor, had become a coffin on tracks. Harold Brooks was 23 years old that summer, though the men in his crew would have sworn he looked closer to 40. He had that quality some men develop in combat, a stillness in the eyes, a way of moving that suggested he was always listening, always calculating. Before the war, he had worked his family's farm outside Des Moines, coaxing life from soil that didn't want to give it, fixing machinery that wasn't meant to be fixed. His hands were thick and scarred, his face weathered by sun and wind, and he spoke rarely, carefully, as if words were a resource to be conserved. He had been in France since June 7th, landing on Utah Beach the day after D-Day as part of the 2nd Armored Division. His tank, a standard M4A1 Sherman with a 75-millimeter gun, was named Homestead, a name his loader had painted on the turret in white letters that were already fading under coats of mud and dust. The crew called Brooks Sarge, though his actual rank was Staff Sergeant, Tank Commander. They trusted him because he had kept them alive through 3 weeks of hedgerow fighting when other tanks in the battalion were burning wrecks, their crews buried in shallow graves marked by helmets on rifles. The crew of Homestead was typical of American armor, a cross-section of the country thrown together by the lottery of war. The driver, Private Danny Sullivan from Boston, was 19 and still wrote letters to his mother every night. The bow gunner, Private First Class Eugene Carter from Alabama, rarely spoke but could field strip and reassemble a Browning .30 caliber machine gun blindfolded. The loader, Corporal James Woody Woodson from Philadelphia, had been a dock worker before the war and could heft a 75-millimeter shell like it weighed nothing. And the gunner, the man who would decide whether they lived or died in combat, was Corporal Michael Kowalski from Chicago, a tool and die maker with steady hands and nerves that didn't rattle even when the world was exploding around him. On the morning of July 14th, Homestead was part of a 4-tank platoon assigned to probe German defenses south of St. Lo, a town that had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing but still held by Wehrmacht forces. The mission was reconnaissance, move forward, identify enemy positions, report back. It was the kind of mission that sounded simple in the briefing tent, but became a nightmare in execution. The platoon moved in single file down a narrow farm lane, barely wide enough for one tank. The Shermans spaced 50 yards apart, engines growling in low gear. The hedgerows rose on either side like walls, blocking visibility, trapping sound. Brooks stood in the turret hatch, his upper body exposed, binoculars raised, scanning the terrain. Standard procedure dictated that tank commanders fought unbuttoned with the hatch open because visibility through periscopes was terrible. And in hedgerow country, the first man to see the enemy often survived, while the blind man died. The air smelled of diesel exhaust, crushed vegetation, and the faint, sweet, sick odor of death that lingered everywhere in Normandy that summer. Overhead, the sky was a flat gray, promising rain. The only sounds were the mechanical rumble of the Shermans and the occasional distant crack of artillery. At 1100 hours, the platoon reached a junction where the lane widened slightly into what had once been a village square. A stone church stood on the north side, its steeple collapsed, its walls pocked with shell holes. Abandoned farm buildings clustered around the square, their roofs caved in, their windows empty. The lead tank, commanded by Lieutenant Pearson, halted at the center of the square, and the other 3 Shermans stopped behind him. Brooks scanned the buildings through his binoculars, looking for movement, for the glint of sunlight on glass or metal, for anything that suggested the Germans were still here. The village felt wrong, too quiet, too empty. In his experience, the Germans didn't abandon good defensive positions without a fight. "Brooks, you seeing anything?" Pearson's voice crackled over the radio, thin and metallic. "Negative, sir. Place looks dead." "All right, hold position. I'm moving forward to that." The transmission ended in a roar of sound and flame. The lead Sherman erupted in a geyser of fire as an 88mm armor-piercing round punched through its frontal armor, detonated the ammunition stored inside, and turned the tank into a furnace. The explosion was so violent that the turret lifted off the hull and crashed down 15 feet away, upside down in the dirt. Brooks dropped into the turret and slammed the hatch shut in one fluid motion, his training overriding the spike of adrenaline. "Back up! Sullivan, reverse now!" But before the driver could engage the transmission, the second Sherman in line, commanded by Sergeant Hayes, was hit. The round struck the turret ring, the junction between the hull and turret, and the tank stopped moving instantly, smoke pouring from the hatches. 2 tanks destroyed in 4 seconds. 10 men dead or dying. And somewhere in the ruins of the village, a German tank, almost certainly a Tiger, was waiting for the next shot. The Tiger, was not just a tank. It was a statement of industrial superiority, a weapon designed to dominate any battlefield. It weighed 56 tons, nearly twice as much as the 33-ton Sherman. Its frontal armor was 4 inches thick, enough to shrug off most Allied anti-tank rounds at combat range. Its gun, the legendary 88mm KWK-36, could penetrate a Sherman's armor at distances exceeding a mile. In every measurable category, armor, firepower, optics, the Tiger was superior. The Sherman, by contrast, was a compromise. It was designed for mass production, for reliability, for ease of repair. Its 75mm gun could penetrate German medium tanks like the Panzer IV at close range. But against a Tiger, it was nearly useless unless you could hit the thinner side or rear armor. The Sherman's own armor, 2 inches at the thickest, could be penetrated by the Tiger's gun from virtually any angle. American tankers had a grim saying, "It takes 5 Shermans to kill a Tiger. The first 4 draw the fire. Brooks knew the odds. He had seen Shermans burn. He had pulled wounded men from hatches while ammunition cooked off inside, had smelled the stench of burning rubber and flesh, had watched good crews die because they were simply outgunned and outmatched. The Sherman was a death trap against heavy German armor, and everyone knew it. But they climbed in anyway because that was the job. Inside Homestead, the crew waited in silence. The only light came from the dim red glow of the instrument panel. Sullivan's hands gripped the steering levers, knuckles white. Carter crouched at the bow gun, peering through the narrow vision slit. Woody stood in the loader's position, one hand on a 75mm shell, ready to slam it into the breech. And Kowalski sat at the gunner's station, eye pressed to the periscope, traversing the turret slowly, searching. Brooks was thinking, not panicking, not praying, thinking. The Tiger had fired twice from concealment, which meant it had good cover and a clear field of fire. The 3rd Sherman in line, commanded by Corporal Davis, was still intact but pinned in place behind Homestead. If Brooks tried to reverse, he would block Davis's escape route. If he tried to advance, he would roll into the Tiger's kill zone. And if he did nothing, the Tiger would methodically destroy them one by one. "Kowalski," Brooks said quietly, "what do you see?" "Nothing, Sarge. Smoke from the lead tanks is blocking everything forward. Can't see the source of fire." Brooks rose slightly and cracked the hatch, just enough to see out. The smoke from the burning Shermans was rolling across the square in thick black clouds, driven by a light breeze. It provided cover, but it also blinded them. The Tiger could be anywhere, in one of the ruined buildings behind a hedgerow, hull down in a ditch. And then Brooks saw it. Not the tank itself, but the shadow of its gun barrel. A long dark line protruding from the collapsed wall of a barn on the east side of the square, perhaps 200 yards away. The Tiger was in defilade, its hull hidden behind rubble, only its turret and gun exposed. A perfect ambush position. At 200 yards, the Sherman's gun might penetrate the Tiger's turret face, if the shot was perfect, if the angle was right, if the ammunition was armor-piercing and not high explosive. But the Tiger's gunner only needed to put a round anywhere on the Sherman's hull to kill them. Brooks closed the hatch and keyed the intercom. "I found him. 2 o'clock in the barn, he's hull down." Kowalski traversed the turret, found the target, and sucked in a breath. "Jesus, Sarge, that's a Tiger." "I know. We can't penetrate that frontal armor. Not from here." "I know." Woody, the loader, spoke for the first time, his voice tight. "So what do we do?" Brooks didn't answer immediately. He was running scenarios in his mind, calculating angles, distances, timing. The Tiger had position. It had armor. It had firepower. The only advantage Homestead had was mobility. The Sherman was faster, more agile, could turn and accelerate more quickly. But mobility meant nothing if you drove into the enemy's gun. And then Brooks remembered something his father had told him years ago, back in Iowa, when they were trying to move a stubborn bull from one pasture to another. You can't beat a bull in a head-on fight, but you can outsmart him if you make him commit to charging the wrong direction. "Sullivan," Brooks said, his voice calm, "when I give the word, I want you to reverse hard, full throttle, straight back down the lane, no hesitation." "Reverse? Sarge, that'll put us—" "I know where it'll put us. Just do it. Kowalski, traverse turret to 9 o'clock, left side, and keep it there. Don't track the Tiger. I want the gun pointed away from him." Kowalski hesitated. "Away from him?" That's right, Woody load he. High explosive, not armor-piercing. A round designed for soft targets, not armor. Sarge, Kowalski said carefully, if we're going after a tiger, we need AP. Load he, Brooks repeated. Woody slid the shell into the breech and locked it. He loaded. Brooks was betting everything on psychology, on what the tiger's commander would think when he saw Sherman suddenly retreat at full speed with its gun pointed in the wrong direction. He was betting that the German, already confident, would assume the Americans were panicking, running, and a running enemy made mistakes. A running enemy exposed his flanks. All right, Brooks said. Sullivan, now. The driver threw the transmission into reverse and floored the throttle. The Sherman lurched backward with a roar, tracks spitting dirt, engine screaming. The tank shot down the lane in reverse, 50 yards, 70, 100, moving faster than most people realized a 33-ton vehicle could move. Inside the Tiger, the German commander, likely a veteran, likely someone who had fought in Russia, saw the Sherman retreating and made a decision. He ordered his driver to advance, to move out from cover and finish the fleeing American tank. The Tiger rolled forward, its massive bulk emerging from the rubble of the barn, turret turning to track the retreating Sherman. It was exactly what Brooks had wanted. Sullivan, hard left, now! The driver yanked the left steering lever, locking the left track, and the Sherman pivoted 90 degrees in a spray of dirt and gravel, swinging its rear end around like a race car drifting through a turn. The sudden maneuver, violent, precise, brought the Sherman perpendicular to the lane, facing east, gun now pointing directly at the advancing Tiger, but not at its frontal armor. The Tiger had committed to the turn, its hull angled as it tried to track the Sherman's movement, and for 3 seconds, maybe less, its side armor was exposed. The armor on the Tiger's flank was only 3 inches thick, less than half the frontal protection. Kowalski, target left, tank, side armor, fire! The gunner had already seen it. His hands moved instinctively, adjusting elevation, centering the reticle on the Tiger's hull just below the turret ring. On target! Fire! The Sherman's 75-millimeter gun roared, the breech slamming backward, the interior filling with acrid smoke and the sharp chemical stink of burnt propellant. The high explosive shell, wrong ammunition for armor, wrong ammunition for everything, crossed the 200 yards in less than a second and struck the Tiger's side armor just above the road wheels. The shell didn't penetrate, but it didn't need to. The impact, the sheer kinetic shock, caused a weld seam to fail. The explosion, concentrated at the point of impact, created a pressure wave that transmitted through the armor plate and into the interior of the Tiger. The effect was catastrophic. The armor held, but the weld didn't, and a section of the inner armor spalled away. Fragments of steel traveling at supersonic speed, ricocheting inside the tank like shrapnel. Inside the Tiger, men screamed. The driver was killed instantly, a fist-sized chunk of steel punching through his seat. The gunner was blinded in one eye, his face lacerated by metal splinters. The loader collapsed, clutching his chest, and the commander, standing in the turret hatch, felt the tank shudder beneath him and realized they were dying. Brooks didn't wait to see the result. Woody, AP, load now. The loader had already yanked another shell from the ready rack, his hands moving in the cramped space with practiced efficiency. AP up! Kowalski, same target, fire when ready. The gunner centered the reticle again, this time on the Tiger's turret. The German tank had stopped moving, smoke beginning to leak from the hatches. It was wounded, but not dead. If the crew recovered, if the gun was still operational, they could still fire on target. Fire! The second round, armor-piercing this time, struck the Tiger's turret face at an angle, penetrated the damaged armor, and detonated inside. The explosion ignited stored ammunition, and the Tiger's interior became a furnace. Flame shot from the hatches, and the commander, standing in the cupola, was engulfed. He tried to climb out, but the fire took him before he could reach the ground. The Tiger burned. Brooks opened his hatch and stood, binoculars raised, watching the German tank die. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph, just the cold, mechanical observation that the threat was neutralized, that his crew was alive, that they had survived another engagement. "Cease fire," he said quietly. "Sullivan, pull forward. Let's get clear of the kill zone." The Sherman rolled forward, engine rumbling, and positioned itself near the ruined church. Behind them, the third Sherman, Davis's tank, emerged from cover, its commander waving from the turret. Over the radio, Davis's voice was shaky. "Brooks, how the hell did you do that?" Brooks didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the burning Tiger, at the two wrecked American tanks, at the bodies of the men who hadn't made it. 10 Americans dead, 5 Germans dead. A tactical victory measured in corpses and wreckage. "Just got lucky," Brooks said finally, though they both knew it wasn't luck. The after-action report filed by the battalion commander noted that Staff Sergeant Harold Brooks had destroyed a German Tiger I tank at close range using a combination of tactical maneuvering and precise gunnery. The report praised his quick thinking and recommended him for the Silver Star. Brooks declined the recommendation. He told his company commander that any tank commander would have done the same, that his crew deserved the credit, that medals didn't bring back the men who died that morning. The Silver Star was awarded anyway. Brooks received it in a brief ceremony 2 weeks later, pinned it inside his jacket, and never wore it again. The crew of Homestead stayed together through the rest of the Normandy campaign, through the breakout at St. Lo, through the race across France. They fought in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, where Sullivan was wounded by shrapnel and evacuated. They crossed the Rhine in March of 1945 and were outside a small German town when the war in Europe ended in May. Brooks came home in the fall of 1945, took the train to Des Moines, and walked the last 3 miles to the family farm. His father was in the barn, repairing a tractor, and when he saw Harold standing in the doorway, he set down his wrench and nodded once. They didn't embrace. They didn't need to. Harold worked the farm for the rest of his life. He married a school teacher named Ruth, had 3 children, and rarely spoke about the war. His Silver Star stayed in a drawer wrapped in cloth. Once, his eldest son found it and asked what it was for. Brooks held the medal for a long moment, then put it back in the drawer. "Something that happened a long time ago," he said. The official records of the engagement were filed away in the National Archives, and for decades, the story of how a Sherman outwitted a Tiger in Normandy remained buried in paperwork and fading memories. The men who had been there knew what happened, but they didn't talk about it much. Some things didn't need to be spoken. Michael Kowalski, the gunner, became a machinist in Chicago and visited Brooks once in Iowa in 1973. They sat on the porch and drank coffee and watched the fields. Kowalski mentioned that he'd still had nightmares about the Tiger, Not about the fear, but about the German commander trying to escape the flames. Brooks nodded. "I see him too," he said quietly, and that was all they said about it. Eugene Carter, the bow gunner, lived in Alabama and wrote Brooks a letter every Christmas until Brooks died in 1998. The letters were short, usually just a few lines. "Hope you and Ruth are well. Still thinking about that day in July. Take care of yourself." Brooks always wrote back. The same number of lines, the same plain language. James Woody Woodson became a longshoreman again, worked the docks in Philadelphia until his back gave out, and died in 2006. His daughter found a photograph in his belongings, a black and white picture of 5 men standing in front of a Sherman tank, the name Homestead visible on the turret. On the back, in her father's handwriting, "Best crew I ever knew." Danny Sullivan, the driver, recovered from his wounds and became a Boston police officer. He attended Brooks's funeral in Iowa and stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left, his hand resting on the headstone. He died in 2012, and his obituary mentioned that he was a veteran of the 2nd Armored Division, but said nothing about the day he reversed a Sherman at full speed to give his tank commander the angle he needed to kill a tiger. There are no statues of Harold Brooks, no monuments, no plaques, no streets named in his honor. The engagement on July 14, 1944, is not taught in military academies as a textbook example of armor tactics, though perhaps it should be. The story exists in fragments, in dusty files, in letters exchanged between aging veterans, in the memories of children who heard their fathers speak of it once, late at night, when the past became too heavy to carry alone. But the lesson remains, etched into the wreckage of that nameless French village and the lives of the men who fought there. War is not won by the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It is won by men who can think when thinking seems impossible, who can act when action means risking everything, who can face the machinery of death and find within themselves something greater than fear. Brooks understood that the Tiger was not just a tank. It was a problem, a puzzle with lethal consequences, and he solved it not with courage alone, but with intelligence, with an intuition born from years of fixing broken things and making impossible situations work. He saw what the German commander expected, and he gave him something else. He turned the Sherman's weakness, its lack of armor, its inferior gun, into an advantage by forcing the Tiger to move, to commit, to expose the one vulnerable point that could be exploited. It was not heroism in the Hollywood sense. There were no speeches, no dramatic music, no slow-motion sequences. It was simply a man doing his job with clarity and precision, making decisions in seconds that would determine whether 5 men lived or died, and then living with those decisions for the rest of his life. The cost was never forgotten. Brooks carried the names of the 10 men who died that morning, Lieutenant Pearson, Sergeant Hayes, and the others, with him always. He knew that his survival was not proof of virtue or skill, but the random mathematics of war, where the difference between life and death is measured in inches and seconds, and the angle of armor plate. He also carried the memory of the German commander burning in the turret of his Tiger, and he understood that courage and duty were not the exclusive property of one side or the other. The Germans in that Tiger had fought with the same determination, the same training, the same human instinct to survive. They had simply been outmaneuvered, and they had paid the price. War makes no distinctions. It consumes the brave and the cowardly, the skilled and the unlucky, without mercy or meaning. What remains is not glory, but memory. The stories we tell to remind ourselves that ordinary men, when faced with impossible choices, sometimes find within themselves the capacity for extraordinary clarity. Harold Brooks was such a man. He did not seek recognition, did not believe he deserved it, and would have been embarrassed by the telling of his story. But his crew knew. The men who served with him knew. And now, perhaps, we can know as well. Not to celebrate war, but to honor the men who fought it, who climbed into steel boxes and faced death with nothing but training, instinct, and the hope that when the moment came, they would do the right thing. Brooks did the right thing, and he came home, and he lived quietly, without fanfare, content in the knowledge that he had done his duty and kept his men alive. In the end, that was all he ever wanted. Did this story remind you of someone's courage? Share your thoughts in the comments.